I'm standing in front of Pippbrook House in Dorking. It's a building that is very familiar to me because I work just opposite it. And prior to lockdown, I used to look out of my window and see the building on a regular basis. Now, returning to it after a long period of being away from the office, it's like returning and seeing an old friend. We're featuring Pippbrook House as part of Heritage Open Days this year because it is a very important building architecturally. The purpose of Heritage Open Days is to celebrate and bring to prominence local heritage, and Pippbrook House is a very important part of our local architectural heritage, not just the building itself but also the stories that surround it and the people who lived there. The theme for Heritage Open Days this year is Hidden Treasures, Hidden Nature, and I hope through this presentation to be able to explain that Pippbrook House is relevant both as a piece of hidden treasure, but also demonstrating certain aspects of hidden nature as well. Looking at the building now, it doesn't look very hidden, and every day hundreds of people walk past it. But there are aspects of the building that I've learned from preparing for this presentation that indicate that there are lots of aspects of it that are not immediately obvious. And again, I hope this presentation gives an insight into the various complexities of the building that we see in front of us. In preparing for the presentation, I'd like to thank Jim Docking from the Dorking Local History Group. His book on the history of the building has been very important in putting forward this presentation. And also you'll be hearing during the presentation about some of the elements of the history of the building in his own words. Let's start with the building we see today. It was built between 1856 and 1858. The appearance can be described as muscular Gothic. It is a matter of personal taste whether you like this form of architecture. Ian Nairn, who edited the Surrey volume of Pevsner's Buildings of England, did not pull his punches when he described it as very ugly. Commentators shortly after its construction were more favourable, preferring it to the more classically styled building it replaced. Whether you like it or not, Pippbrook House and its designer, the influential and prolific architect George Gilbert Scott, played an important part in a battle of styles that played out in the middle to latter part of the 19th century, that is, the battle between the Gothic and Classical. This was seen not just as a battle of taste, but of morals. Advocates of the Gothic, promoted in particular by Augustus Pugin, regarded it as the only true English style, untainted by the horrors of the post-Reformation age, while classicism was considered pagan. George Gilbert Scott was one of the great advocates of the Victorian Gothic. He designed over 700 buildings, and much of these were churches. But he was also influential in converting mid-19th century secular buildings to the Gothic style, including, of course, Pippbrook House. Scott played a key role in the outcome of the Battle of Styles, but not in the way you might think. He submitted drawings for an architectural competition to design the Foreign Office in London. It was a commission he won, but only after he was persuaded to abandon his Gothic principles and change the high Victorian Gothic style of his original designs and move to a more classical style. The Gothic never recovered its force as the one pure style. It is therefore in this context that we view Pippbrook House, an important representative of the Gothic style more unusually applied to a domestic house by an architect who was central to the great battle of architectural taste that took place during the Victorian era. Pippbrook House has a Grade 2 star listing, an accolade given to a relatively few number of listed buildings and defined as being of particular importance and of more than local importance. Before looking in more detail at the features of the present building, let's go back in time to consider the history of the site before Scott designed the present building. The 1758 house was built by William Page. It is described in a contemporary account as a handsome house with 2 wings connected with a body of colonnades. Another description refers to it as a neat brick building with winged offices which projected forward and were joined by circular colonnades. The house was referred to then as Pippbrook House. We know what it looked like from a painting thought to be by James Cantor and dated to the 1790s. This is the building that Scott altered and extended to create the current house. Between 1817 and 1928, only 3 families occupied Pippbrook House. The most important of these families was the Foreman family, who occupied the estate for 40 years from 1849 to 1889, and it is on this period that I would like to focus. William Henry Foreman inherited the estate from his brother in 1850. Although Pippbrook House was probably little more than a weekend retreat for him, he commissioned George Gilbert Scott to turn the classically styled building he had inherited into a Gothic mansion. The works were ambitious, with significant remodelling and a large extension to the front, a high-pitched roof and dormers, as well as the 2-storey museum to the rear, which was probably added at a slightly later date. The museum produced an asymmetrical design, and its windows are of a more advanced design than others, with pointed traceried elements. Construction took 3 years and cost $2.5 million at today's prices. William could afford it. He had made a fortune as the owner of the Penydarren Ironworks at Merthyr Tydfil in Wales. Whatever you might think of the style of the building, it was sumptuously decorated and beautifully crafted, particularly its interiors. The Welsh dragons that adorn the parapet reflect William's Welsh connection, as does the craft of ironworking shown in the tracery, in the windows and on the main staircase. The external design of windows and doors, with their mid-pointed arches, buttresses, and steeply pitched roofs, are typical Gothic features. The attention to detail can be seen in the design of the roundels above the windows, and even the design of the door knocker. The level of craftsmanship is of a very high order, with designs rarely repeated. The carvings illustrate countryside plants and foliage. To either side of the doorway arch is the Foreman family crest, just one of a number of locations where William Foreman literally stamped his mark on the building. The internal decorations are particularly fine. The ground floor layout showed an entrance hall, of which was a dining room to the right and a large drawing room straight ahead. To the left, off a corridor, were the library and morning room with conservatory looking south. On the east side was a billiard room and a service yard. Both William and his brother were keen collectors of artefacts and antiquities from the ancient world, and some 4,000 items were displayed in the museum room on the northeast side of the building and in the basement below it. The museum appeared to be for private consumption only. The museum ceiling is coffered with painted panels depicting a starry firmament. There are also painted panels of exotic beasts. Bible quotations are incorporated into the decoration, mostly on the theme of wisdom, including a quotation from Proverbs, which feels particularly apt for the circumstances of Pippbrook House. Through wisdom an house is builded, and by understanding it is established, and by knowledge are the chambers filled with all precious pleasant riches. Beautiful stone and wood carving are liberally distributed throughout the interiors. This illustration shows the initials of William Henry Foreman and the date of the building carved into the doorway panels. Flora and fauna are featured in various locations, each one exquisitely detailed. Staircases incorporate elaborate wood carving foliate decoration. The door cases are beautifully carved, the degree of elaboration reflecting the status of the bedroom. The linen fold carved doors are decorated with finely detailed metal decoration. Painted arches adorn the museum room and the main staircase, where there is a stylized oak tree incorporating the Foreman family motto in Latin, which translates as "Deeds surpass words." The house also incorporates stenciled and hand-painted ceilings with decorative plasterwork ceiling roses and covings. By contrast, the basement of the house is very plain, but does give some insight into the workings of a large Victorian house and the scale of the operation involved in servicing the occupants. The functions of each room are difficult to ascertain today, but you can take an educated guess from the features that survive. For example, some rooms have substantial locks and racking, suggesting that they held expensive items such as wine, food, or crockery. One story of alleged theft is told by Jim and highlights the importance of security.
Indeed, a scandal. The butler here left without any warning, and he was charged with the theft of silverware. But the Dorking magistrates considered the case, and in the end they dismissed it because they said there was just insufficient evidence.
Clearly, life in the house was not always straightforward. In 1893 there was a fire, and again Jim takes up the story.
The flames, in fact, were so high that they attracted people from all over Dorking, and they came flocking here to see what was going on. But the firemen were in a bit of a pickle because they didn't know where to get the water from. So they had to get the water from Pippbrook Mill Pond across the London Road. So all this took time before they could actually attend to the fire.
William Foreman died in 1869, and the house and estate became the responsibility of 3 trustees, with the instructions that nothing should change. The house remained in the Foreman family until 1891, when it was sold to the Aggs family. In 1930 it was sold to Dorking Urban District Council to be used as a town hall, and with the council chamber housed in the former museum. It has remained a public building ever since. The importance of Pippbrook House is, in part, its role in this great debate during towards the end of the 19th century, the debate between the contrasting styles of the classical and the Gothic. And it's also important as a piece of work by George Gilbert Scott, one of the most prolific of Victorian architects. And I would say also it's important because it demonstrates some wonderful craftsmanship in the decoration, both on the inside and the outside of the building. And it's important to us locally here in Mole Valley because of the story of the people who lived here and the influence that they had on the social and architectural life of Dorking.